I'm really happy to introduce Nicole Schwab here, and she has agreed to come in person, despite her broken ankle. So really happy. Nicole is the co-director of the platform to accelerate nature-based solution and 1 trillion trees at the World Economic Forum. And so I think we really look forward to listening to your speech. We have heard you a year ago when we relaunched Swiss Business for Nature, and I think it will be really inspiring to hear some facts and figures about the future of nature and business, but also how to embrace the biodiversity challenge, which we talked about in our prep call. So, Nicole, the floor is yours.
Hello, so I'm delighted to be addressing you, and I've been asked to give a bit of a big picture. And so what I want to start with, and a lot has already been mentioned by Stuart and by André, but what I wanted to start with is a little bit of a reflection of what has happened in the last 2 years, and why is it that today, on this topic of nature-based solutions, yes, there is a great urgency, but there's also an incredible opportunity. And it's actually quite exciting what the possibilities are if we embrace them. Next slide, please. So I'm going to cover 5 key developments since 2020. Just in these short 2 years, a lot has happened, not just COVID, but a lot has happened. And then some reflections from COP26 on Glasgow. Stuart touched upon it already, but I think it's been quite an important moment and defining for some of the things that are coming now for the next months and years. And then finally, a few thoughts on where do we go from here. Next slide. So the first thing that was quite interesting is in 2020, so the World Economic Forum every year issues a global risks report, surveying thousands of decision makers, asking them about their perception of risk. And in 2020, so this is based on a survey of 2019, for the first time you can see these green dots. I'm not expecting you to be able to read it, but what you can see is at the top right corner, which means highest likelihood and highest impact in terms of risk perception, we have 4 environmental risks: extreme weather, climate action failure, biodiversity loss, natural disasters, and human-made environmental disasters, actually 5. So this really showed a bit of a kind of shift in perception and understanding that actually not only climate, but also ecosystem collapse was starting to be a risk directly relevant for business. Next slide. And this, by the way, since then, in last year, 2021, obviously pandemics rose to the top, but the environmental risks were still there. And the preliminary results I've seen for the 2022 report, the environmental risks are still high up, but there's a bit of a difference between perception of short-term risk and medium-term risk, with some of the social disruptions being on people's minds. And that will come out in the next month. Second important trend is over the last few years, we've had much more data on the state of biodiversity, first with the IPBES report, and then with a number of follow-up reports that came out. I mean, the big figure, 1 million species at risk of extinction, that really started to come into people's awareness, but also more awareness on the loss of topsoil and the consequences for agriculture, more awareness on, coral reefs, fisheries, insect populations, and the direct link that this has with food security. So kind of also shifting all of this from a purely environmental agenda to something becoming very relevant for society at large. Not that it wasn't before, but the perception moved and really this kind of became mainstream. More recently, we've also had the Science Panel for the Amazon that released their findings, and Glasgow warning of huge risk and tipping points that for the Amazon if we continue on this trajectory, with dramatic consequences on freshwater flows and climate regulation, not only locally but globally. Next slide. Third, the economics of biodiversity. André touched upon it, but in these last 2 years, we've also moved from a situation where it is taken for granted that we get these free services from nature that are not incorporated in any balance sheets. It was estimated, there's different figures out there, but one of the estimates is 125 trillion a year of free support to the economy from ecosystem services. And we've moved from that to actually starting to think about natural capital and quantifying natural capital. And the Dasgupta review earlier this year on the economics of biodiversity showed this figure that, yes, we have been growing human capital, produced capital, at the expense of natural capital. And between 1992 and 2014, while produced capital doubled, human capital increased by 13%, natural capital per capita, all of these dropped by 40%. So kind of an understanding, even in the language of economics, that this is absolutely not sustainable. And finally, in the World Economic Forum's first New Nature Economy report, we then quantified that $44 trillion, over half the world's GDP, is moderately or highly dependent on natural capital and ecosystem services. So again, this really starting to come. We're not quite there yet, where Andre said we should be definitely to really start to incorporate nature risk into businesses, into national accounting, but we are moving in this direction much more than we have in the past. Next slide. Fourth, what does this mean? Again, an understanding that we need to shift business models, that business as usual is no longer an option, because this is going to lead us into the wall. If we continue depleting natural capital, we're going to have increasing risks, we're going to have increasing costs to the economy, dramatic consequences for society, and so that actually we need to shift towards nature positive models, and therefore that we are no longer talking just about net zero from a business perspective, but about net zero and nature positive. And that's really been a very interesting shift, that this concept is starting to become more widely understood and accepted. And we estimated that this was an opportunity, that there are 15 transitions in the systems that have the biggest impact on nature loss. These systems are food, land, and ocean use, infrastructure and the built environment, and energy and extractives. And if we transition, we can actually generate 395 million jobs and $10 trillion in annual business opportunities. What are these transitions? I'll give you a few examples. I didn't want to go through all of them, but these are the things that we are going to talk about today. Sustainable management of forests, regenerative agriculture, sustainable fisheries, circular economies, more efficient urban utilities. So really in each of these, what are the things that we can do to transition these business models? And finally, this is relevant for large companies and how can they start to take that step towards shifting, but also for all the new businesses that are being created. And that's why it's so exciting that we will hear from many of you today, because it's this ecopreneur revolution of these new enterprises that have nature regeneration at their core, that are really showing the way that it's possible to create this new circular regenerative economy. Next slide. And then the fifth trend in terms of kind of looking at where we've come from is really this kind of coming together of the climate and nature narratives. And this is only one angle, and Stuart talked about it much more and more broadly, but I did want to show this because I think an increased recognition of the essential role of natural climate solutions, so the role of nature-based solutions for achieving our climate goals, and particularly in terms of avoided deforestation and peatland impact and reforestation. So what you can see here, it's an estimation based upon a 1.5 degree trajectory. A lot of numbers, so I don't necessarily want to go into all of it, but I just wanted to give you a sense. The blue, the 7 gigatons of CO2 is the estimated abatement potential of natural climate solutions out of the total. So about a third on that trajectory, both in terms of avoiding additional emissions through avoiding reforestation and sequestration through mainly reforestation, can be provided by nature. So there's kind of this understanding that these two are inextricably linked. Of course, there's much more than climate to the nature conversation, but really a coming together and a kind of understanding that's starting to be translated in frameworks and metrics and business strategies. So next slide. So that leads us to Glasgow. And indeed, this year, land use, forestry was really at the heart of many conversations in a way that hasn't been the case before. And the Glasgow Leaders Declaration is very interesting because it does provide this framework for thinking about sustainable land use and kind of the way forward with these commitments, 141 countries, more than 90% of the global forest cover. And I'm talking a little bit more about forests. That's, of course, one of the areas I work in more. But, of course, all the ecosystems are equally as important, all the other ecosystems. Without going through it, it's more just to give you the big picture, and I'm sure many of you were there and are very aware of this declaration. So next thing I want to mention about Glasgow is on financing. Next slide. Second thing from Glasgow, very interesting, significant new financial commitments. Lots of announcements for this space particularly. We have a Global Forest Finance Pledge, Congo Basin Facility, an Indigenous Peoples Facility, multilateral banks committing to mainstream nature positive, enhanced guidance from the TCFD. I mean, Stuart touched upon that as well. Also, some innovative finance mechanisms for the Amazon, Cerrado, and Chaco. The LEAF Coalition, 1 billion of finance for key jurisdictions. So more and more capital is actually being committed for this space. So this was really, we're definitely not where we need to be, but definitely a great step in the right direction. Final slide from Glasgow, final reflection. Next slide. About private sector engagement. So again, deeper private sector engagement, clearer as well. More understanding of the urgency of the risks of the coming together of these agendas. And these are some of the things that happened, and not all of it may have, and some of this is actually very significant. There were some leading financial institutions that committed to tackle deforestation, 12 of the largest traders that committed also to a sectoral roadmap, which is not just about climate, but obviously is around land use. And this whole land use transition. So very interesting. We had the LEAF Coalition again, and with 19 multinationals engaged in it. And from the OneT.org side, we had 25 companies pledging to restore 3.5 billion trees across 50 countries. So lots of momentum, lots of announcements, a global framework that has really started to position nature-based solutions and kind of in that framing from business of transitioning to a nature-positive net zero economy, more financing. Where do we go from here? Final slide. So first, I think we need to continue really pushing for this integrated narrative. I mean, this was, we're starting to get there, but by no means is this an acquired narrative. And I think it's really very important to continue to have this holistic perspective, these interrelationships, and how we need to address this as a whole and not piecemeal. Second, of course, now it's time to move from commitments to action. Lots of commitments. And what does that mean? That means transparency, it means accountability, it means clear metrics to track progress. And that, of course, has a lot of implications in terms of how we track, in terms of the frameworks, but a lot of work is being done there, notably also by IUCN, and I think we have a lot of solutions out there that we can leverage for this. Fourth, we need more partnerships across stakeholder groups. We know that when it comes to really kind of these solutions on the ground, there is a need to develop capacity to scale, and that really, and that relates to my next point, where we need more finance, but we need to ensure that the financial instruments are adapted to local needs, and kind of really bridging these billions that have been committed to what the absorptive capacity is on the ground, the capacity building, and the needs of the ecopreneurs and local initiatives. And then finally, more inclusion, working with Indigenous peoples and local communities, and also youth, which is something that also came out very strongly from Glasgow. So, as I said, I think we have a huge opportunity, but it will require a lot more work and really starting to get into the details of how do we transition from these big visions, from these commitments to action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicole, also for some of these facts and trends, but also highlighting the need that we need to move from commitments to action. I think this is really critical, and I hope we can contribute with Innovate for Nature to this development.